Karl von Mogel from the Biofortified Blog, and with me is Ron Stotish from AquaBounty. Hello, Ron. How are you doing?
Good morning.
So you're the CEO of AquaBounty,
Very well.
right?
I'm CEO and President of AquaBounty Technologies.
So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about AquaBounty?
Well, I'm a scientist, or as my youngest son tells his friends, I used to be a scientist. I have a PhD in molecular biology. I worked for many years in the animal health industry in basic research and development. And for the last 10 or 12 years, I've been working in biotechnology. Specifically the last 7 years with AquaBounty, developing the AquAdvantage Salmon.
Okay, so can you tell us about the AquAdvantage Salmon, how it was developed, and how does the trait work?
Well, the technology goes back to 1989. It's a fairly simple construct. The AquAdvantage Salmon is an Atlantic salmon. It reaches market weight in about half the time compared to its non-modified comparators. The technology is very straightforward. The original development was the introduction of a single copy of the growth hormone gene from the Chinook salmon into embryos from an Atlantic salmon, and then identifying founders that were capable of passing on the trait and expressing the trait. So the fish has been bred now for more than 20 years using conventional breeding. The fish has been extremely well characterized. The fish not only grows to market weight at about half the time, but it has about a 20% better feed conversion, meaning that it takes 20% less food to get to the same weight.
Now, is that because it's not spending a long portion of its life, like in the winter time, where it's not growing, so it's just kind of, it keeps growing?
That's part of the reason. The other part of the reason is it's not diverting energy for reproduction or other issues, but it is more efficient because its growth hormone gene is basically turned on, allowing it to grow whenever the conditions are permissive. If there's food available, the water temperature appropriate. In the unmodified salmon, as you know, in the winter and in times of low light, when the photoperiod is low, the fish simply doesn't feed and doesn't grow. So this overcomes sort of if you will, an inherent nature barrier to growth in Atlantic salmon.
And I suppose it makes sense out in the wild, because in the wintertime, waters are cold, and if there's not very much abundant food, you don't want to try growing. So
I would probably hide in the gravel then too. Yes.
Yeah. So the wild salmon are limited when they're in the wild because the food is limited, and
Correct.
so what you're looking to do is make a fish that you then raise in a fish farm, and it would just continue to grow rather than stop growing through the wintertime.
Exactly, and it's important to note that Atlantic salmon is an exclusively farmed species. There are wild Atlantic salmon, but there are no wild Atlantic salmon commercial fisheries. So the Atlantic salmon that's consumed around the world, if you're eating Atlantic salmon, unless you caught it yourself, it was raised in an aquaculture facility of some description. So it's an exclusively farmed species, and being able to regulate its growth or to allow it to grow in the manner that I've described, it has real economic consequences.
Okay, so we're talking about fish farming, and so I got a couple of questions about the whole farming process. So you're not looking to have this salmon raised in an ocean pen, you're looking to have it raised in an inland pen, right?
In fact, if our fish is approved by FDA, the condition of use will be to be reared in land-based contained aquaculture systems. Those can be tanks, they can be raceways, but they have to be physically contained.
So they can't be connected to the ocean.
It's not a sea cage operation, exactly.
Okay, so then, so in this kind of like tank environment, how, what's it like for the welfare of the fish? How does that compare to like a wild fish or like an ocean farmed fish? It's one of the questions we've had from our readers is, how are the animals going to be treated?
Well, an analogy is sort of a domesticated animal. The wild fish has to forage for food, has to deal with predators, has to deal with rapidly changing environmental conditions, climate change, and so forth. In the farmed environment, particularly in the contained farmed environment that we employ, the fish are grown in tanks. They're fed basically to satiety every day, and their environment is completely controlled. So the health and welfare of the fish is important in producing healthy food, and we take great pains to ensure that those fish are in a very pleasant environment. Frankly, our fish are more interested in eating and growing than they are interested in anything else. So they live in a fairly defined environment.
Okay. So then, so like, what about like, how does this compare to like wild farm? Oh, no, sorry, not wild. Ocean farmed fish. Because I noticed that the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch basically calls ocean farmed salmon as the worst choice for the environment if you're going to be buying salmon, and then they actually have like some inland tank salmon as like the sort of the best kind that you could buy along with the wild Alaskan cod.
Well, it's interesting that the Monterey Bay Aquarium and many of the other environmental groups cite land-based contained aquaculture as the proper way. Our fish enables that production for salmon because of its growth rate, because of its properties, because of its efficiency, yet they oppose us. But the comparison between sea cage and land-based is simple. In the sea cage operation, the young fish are reared generally in hatcheries, sometimes in lakes. Then they're put into these sea cages. Sea cages can be disrupted by predators, seals, sharks. Fish can escape. Unconsumed food and other debris can filter through the bottom of the sea cage and basically...
And their waste?
And their waste can infiltrate the sediment below the cages. You can have storms that disrupt the cages and allow escapes of fish. And you basically have the potential of an alternate use or perhaps somewhat unpleasant to some people use of coastline regions where they could be used for recreation or so forth. They're caged in active production. So aquaculture in sea cages is a viable industry, and in many parts of the world is practiced very successfully. This is an alternative, and it's an alternative that many environmental organizations have embraced. So we're hopeful. We think this is aquaculture of the future, and that's one of the reasons that we're committed to it.
Okay. So then, so I understand that there's been quite a bit of opposition to the AquAdvantage salmon from like the wild Alaska salmon fisheries and some Alaskan politicians, basically anybody from the areas where they do the actual wild salmon fishing. But then it kind of seems like this would be more competition for the farmed salmon industry than it would be the wild caught. I mean, can you comment on that? Wouldn't this be like more something that could replace like these sea cages than the wild?
You're absolutely correct.
Yeah.
And that's an argument that we've been making since day one. Most people don't appreciate there really are two salmon markets. There's the Atlantic salmon market, which is exclusively cultured, and there is the wild Pacific market, which is basically managed, ranched, or wild-caught market. Alaskans release about 2 billion young fish each year, and then over the next few years they catch about 4% of those fish as they mature and come back to their spawning areas where they were released. The Alaskan product is a distinct product. It's a different species. If you've ever had it, it's a very good product, but it's more like a trout. And that fish is basically a wild-caught product. If you go into the food market, it's very easy to tell which is the Alaskan wild-caught and which is the farm, because the Alaskan wild-caught will sell anywhere between $12 and $30 a pound, and the farm salmon generally is the $5 to $8 a pound. Many people prefer one or the other, but quite frankly, they're both good. In the United States, about 50% of the consumption is Alaskan wild and 50% is farm. But you're quite correct. Because they're so well differentiated in terms of price points, in terms of distribution, and in terms of product quality, we will not compete or in any way erode sales of that wild caught market. It's a different species. We do hope to capture some of that market for that farm species. And in 2012, the United States imported 500 million pounds of farmed Atlantic salmon. there's a tremendous opportunity there to grow that fish in the United States, create jobs in an environmentally sustainable production system. So we think that's the opportunity, and we believe the Alaskans, frankly, are reacting with economic protectionism that is inappropriate.
Okay. So, so let me see. Let me ask you about a little bit more about the tanks versus the wild. So versus the sea cages and stuff like that. So so there is going to be no. Your approval is not going to involve anything connected to the ocean, and a lot of people didn't quite understand that. But then some people have been concerned about the potential for escapes if someone, let's say, they're transporting eggs or something like that, and they, somehow fall into the ocean and release it and all that. What sort of measures are you taking beyond just the containment of the tanks to see that this doesn't impact the natural populations?
Yeah. You've raised two important levels of confusion. One is that our fish can escape to the oceans, and as I've said, they'll be raised in land-based contained aquaculture systems. The other concern is, and we were aware of this when we were developing the product, there would be an emotional concern, simply because this is a new application. So what our eggs, the eggs that we sell, will be all female. And that's an interesting trick. You can do that in fish, and it's sold in many fish species, monosex population. Our fish will be to a high degree triploid, which means that they're incapable of reproduction. And our process for triploidy is validated to exceed 99%. And last but not least, our fish will only be approved in contained aquaculture systems. Now, in addition to all of that, there have been ecological and environmental research studies that have published as our application was pending, and since 2010, for instance. That research has shown that our fish are at least tenfold, if even intact sexually mature fish, are at least tenfold less efficient in securing a mate and successfully breeding. What that means is that the trait would disappear probably in a generation, even if it were deliberately introduced into the environment. And the last point of that is there has to be a wild population for it to interact with. And there are some wild populations of Alaskan, or of Atlantic salmon, for instance, in Maine and in the Great Lakes in some areas. But there are no native populations, for instance, that occur in land-based systems, or that would represent a threat to biological diversity or fish for us to interact with. So that risk, we believe, has been mitigated by the redundant biological and physical containment measures that we've introduced into the product, accepting that people had a concern. But we really think we've covered all those bases.
Okay. So then, one of the questions we got from one of our readers, which I thought was kind of interesting, is there's a sort of a myth going around that companies like with genetically engineered crops want to spread their crops all over the world, so then they can sue everybody. Let's say in the unlikely situation where an AquAdvantage salmon somehow gets out and it's diploid and it manages to lay some eggs and breed, and there's a little pocket population of them somewhere, and somebody starts fishing for these salmon, and they find out, oh gosh, these are AquAdvantage salmon. Are you going to start suing them for fishing for that?
No. First of all, it's not only...
Okay, we're on record about that right here. Okay, so...
It's an unlikely scenario, but because of all of the redundant provisions that I've described, that is an extremely unlikely scenario. And it's much different than the case you're referring to, are the genetically modified soybeans. In that case, is pending before the Supreme Court right now.
Yeah.
But that's not an issue with our product.
Okay. So let me ask you about where they're born and raised. So like you're raising the eggs in one place right now, and then the fish themselves are being raised in another place, right?
Well, our brood stock are in our hatchery in Prince Edward Island, and that's a very state-of-the-art, sort of good manufacturing practice compliant hatchery. It's unique, perhaps the only one of its kind in the world. the present facility where we're growing fish is actually in the highlands of Panama. A most unusual place to grow salmon. Salmon is a cold water fish, but the conditions for growing salmon successfully exist at elevation where we have 8 to 12 degree centigrade water, and we grow these fish in tanks, and they're well contained. And it turns out that it demonstrates the value of the technology, being able to grow a fish in an ecosystem or an environment where it couldn't otherwise be grown, and it can be grown quite successfully.
So why the selection of Panama then? Like, why not, let's say, have the growth tank, at Prince Edward Island or somewhere around the United States,
Well, there were a lot of reasons. Most of them, as in many projects, we're a small company, we had limited resources. We had an interested, motivated, progressive individual who was in the trout farming business, who had some land that had a suitable water supply and was very interested in working with him. So for us, it presented the possibility of doing something literally for a fraction of what it would cost us to do it in the United States or in Canada. So we built a facility for a fraction of the cost it would have considered. And the other part of it was the location offers the demonstration that this fish can be grown in places that you don't traditionally associate with salmon aquaculture. And last but not least, in addition to the containment barriers that I've already described, the geothermal containment barriers represented in this facility assures that even if fish were deliberately released, they would not survive.
So what do you mean by that?
Because the water flows from elevation down, and as it flows down towards the Pacific, it warms. It warms to a temperature beyond that which salmon can feed and survive. And there are a series of 6 hydroelectric power plants which take the water in, run it through turbines, and then put it back out. So it would be a little like it'll be a little like putting a fish through a Waring blender. So the geothermal barriers represent an additional level of containment, assuring that there's no interaction. If the fish were eventually to somehow manage to get to the Pacific, there are no Atlantic salmon in the Pacific for them to interact with. So from a standpoint of containment, from a standpoint of biosecurity, it represents sort of the ultimate belt, suspender, redundant containment systems, assuring that there's no risk.
Okay. So let's talk about safety. One of the things that people have been talking about with regard to these fish, it's a transgenic fish. It's a new thing. It's going through the regulatory process. The FDA is reviewing it. So what do we know about its safety? How does it compare to the natural Atlantic salmon?
Well, if you go to the FDA's website, you can see the briefing document that they released for the Veterinary Medical Advisory Committee meeting in 2010. They cite the data and summarize it there. To make a long story short, we've measured essentially everything that you can measure in the fish. The conclusion is that this is identical to the traditional food. Remember, we're expressing a salmon growth hormone gene in a salmon. That protein is consumed when you're eating salmon, either Pacific or Atlantic, and so there's nothing new here. The composition is identical to the traditional, and the conclusion of the FDA and the advisory panel was that this fish is as safe to eat as the traditional food. If you have a food allergy to fish now, you will probably have a food allergy to our salmon. If you do not have a food allergy to salmon, then you will not have a food allergy problem with our fish. So it's an Atlantic salmon. It is identical and as safe as the traditional food.
Okay, so then, so how about the welfare of the AquAdvantage salmon? So there are sort of fast-growing and like extra-muscled animals, for instance, that don't fare as well or not as healthy as ones that aren't like that. Does this change how the salmon themselves, their own individual health?
Well, the regulatory process is very complicated. People say that we should have used a food additive petition process or some other process. None of those would have required determining safety to the target animal. Because we were using the new animal drug process, we actually had to do what used to be called target animal safety. They're now called durability and stability. But in those studies, we looked basically at everything that you could look at in the salmon. including behavior and predator avoidance and behavior in the water column. And then the detailed histology, physiology of the fish compared to the non-transgenic controls. To make a long story short, there are some changes. The changes are mostly due, interestingly enough, to the triploidy, a procedure which is not regulated and is widely used in all fish industries.
What kinds of changes in general does the triploidy?
Well, you see some things like changes in the gill structure and in respiration rates and some of those issues, because you basically have larger red blood cells because they contain more DNA and so forth. They're not outside the range of normal physiological limits, but they're slightly different from the diploid. Interestingly enough, we found no differences that were truly associated with the rapid growth phenotype or with the transgene, with the exception of the rapid growth rate. Now, along with that comes a slightly higher respiration rate, a slightly higher oxygen consumption, but all, again, within the physiological limits of the salmon, and really no adverse effects on the health of the salmon.
So let me just explain a little bit about the triploidy. This came up a little bit earlier when talking about sterility. Triploidy is having 3 copies of every chromosome. We're diploid. We have 2 copies of every chromosome. Some common triploids you might run into are seedless watermelons that are seedless because they're triploid. And there are also some seedless limes that are triploid. Bananas, another example. But not cucumbers, that's something else.
And many of the fish that you consume.
Yeah, that's what my next question is going to be. Is so, what are some fish that people consume today that are triploid?
Trout, tilapia, some catfish. It's a technique that's employed quite commonly for regulating reproduction.
That is something I did not know. I study plants, but I do buy tilapia in the store.
Shellfish. There's a whole variety of seafoods that are produced. Some even as tetraploids, believe it or not.
Oh, interesting. I gotta read more about polyploidy in fish and aquaculture. That's interesting. So, there's no difference from the AquAdvantage trait, the growth trait, in terms of like the levels of nutrients, its composition. Is there any difference in like stuff like omega-3 fatty acids, protein?
It grows faster. It's more efficient, but the composition of the fish is exactly the same as the non-modified.
How does it taste? It tastes the same?
It tastes exactly the same, and one of the benefits will be being able to offer a consumer a fish that is much fresher than if you were flying it from southern Chile or from Norway.
So yeah, let me ask you about that. Like, I live in Madison, Wisconsin. So the nearest ocean is at least 1,000 miles away. But as far as like, to get, sushi grade salmon, for instance, it's going to be coming from the Pacific. That's going to be at least 2,000 miles away.
Could be. It could be coming from Chile, which is 4,000 miles away.
Which could be even further.
or Norway. So.
When I was reading about this, I got to thinking, wait a second, couldn't you set up a tank somewhere in Wisconsin or Illinois or something like that, right in the middle of where we're producing all this corn and soy and everything like that, and you'd have like your food source for raising the salmon, and then you can have the salmon right there, and then you ship it a couple of 100 miles, and then have something that's like even fresher than you would have otherwise. I mean, you could be eating a salmon sushi in a sushi restaurant in Madison, right? Where the salmon was caught that day or the day before.
What a marvelous idea! just like hogs and
local salmon in the Midwest. Sure. I mean, it's kind of like a. Well, I mean, that's one of the things that comes out.
That's the opportunity.
People come up with ideas like this. So you can get sushi grade fish from the tank systems, right?
Absolutely.
All right. Okay. Good. Because I like sushi.
That's truly the opportunity. Aside from all of the other environmental benefits, aside from the economic development benefits, you can provide a fresh food that's identical to the traditional food that the consumer.
I would be interested to see, because there have been things like this when it comes to transgenics. There was an experiment done with transgenic apples, not the actual apples, but it was a social science experiment where people were given pictures of apples and prices and the descriptions of where they came from, and then they rated what's the sort of the extra amount people are willing to pay for an apple that comes from your local area versus how much less are they willing to pay for an apple that's genetically engineered. And it turns out that they were more willing to buy or pay a slightly higher price for a local genetically engineered apple, labeled as such, versus a 2,000 mile away Washington State, this was done in Illinois, Washington State, non-genetically engineered apple. And I'm like, wait a second, because the trait was actually, they're talking about fungus resistance, and they got a problem with fungal diseases in the Midwest that they don't have in Washington. And I'm just thinking, when it comes to food politics, people think about like local and natural and organic as being one sort of category, and then like industrial, genetically engineered, and all that sort of stuff in a different category. But yet, there's actually an opportunity to have things that are local and genetically engineered that give you this like potential change to the food system that neither of those two categories do.
Absolutely correct. And we should think of those in terms of their societal value and their impact on our food choices. This technology is very compatible with the locavore sort of movement, and we think that makes a great deal of sense.
Okay. So, the fish have attracted a lot of attention over the years. What are some common claims that you've heard about the AquAdvantage salmon, and then what are the facts about it?
Well, certainly the claim is that somehow it's different or unsafe, and certainly the results of the FDA's evaluation of our data and the published review have concluded and publicized the fact that it's identical to the traditional food. So I think that's the biggest barrier that we face. The second one is that this somehow represents an environmental risk. One of the concerns that frequently comes up is this so-called Trojan gene theory. And the idea is that there's a gene that's introduced into the population, and the gene confers a reproductive benefit, but a reduced fitness. So ultimately it causes the collapse in the population.
So it outbreeds the wild, but then it's less healthy.
It's unfit, So, and the one of the authors of that is a person at Purdue, Dr. William Muir, who has evaluated our data and has said publicly in writing and in meetings that that Trojan gene hypothesis doesn't apply to our fish, that our fish is in fact safer and more environmentally safe than the conventional alternative, and less likely to reduce biodiversity. So Dr. Muir has both in writing and in person communicated that to some of the people still making these claims, but they continue to cite that as evidence that somehow.
I know that they've, like the Center for Food Safety, they did a little thing where they did a video with I think Andrew Kimbrell, and he's saying that once that one fish gets out in the environment, then the math starts, and then it will just wipe out all life on the earth or something like that. That's interesting. The person,
drama, but fiction.
One of the people who came up with that very idea that they're using is saying, no, that doesn't apply for this.
And the really shameful thing about that is that he's told them in public and in writing, and they continue to use it. Interestingly enough, they also cite his publication as evidence that more antibiotics will be used. The word antibiotic doesn't appear in that publication at all. So what it tells me is that they're perfectly comfortable misrepresenting and dishonestly presenting information to cast our product in a bad light.
So then let me ask you, have there been any criticisms that you've heard in all the public discussion over the years that you thought were actually pretty good? Like they point out something you weren't thinking about, whether it's like a scientific thing or a social thing, economic, that helped you see your product in a different light?
Well, I think what's been helpful to us is we've had people come forward and talk to us about perceived benefits that we hadn't considered. They're not necessarily criticisms, but they're alternatives and other applications, and that's really the strength in innovation, isn't it? Sometimes you develop a new product, and people see, based on that sort of paradigm shift, new opportunities and new products, and that's been interesting. We've had many people come to us seeing that this is an opportunity to enhance global food security, to enhance and create perhaps an American salmon industry that doesn't exist today, and other sorts of things that frankly, when we began this development, we hadn't considered.
Okay. So the AquAdvantage salmon has been involved in the regulatory process for a long time. How long has it been?
Well, the INAD was established in 1995. That's the beginning of the process. Now, that's a little bit misleading because the discussion, and dialogue may be a more appropriate word, on how to regulate this technology really wasn't finalized until 2009. And in 2009, the Center for Veterinary Medicine published their guidance on this. And during that time, and I mentioned that as early as 1999, FDA was giving talks about this being the first potential transgenic food animal. During that time, we were working with them on the sorts of studies that might be required, and in fact, and perhaps in a way, helped develop that guidance with the agency. But when they issued the guidance, then we completed the last few studies that we had to and made our final submission. The total length of time since 1995, the really meaningful time in the final review process with a legitimate regulatory paradigm has really been since 2009.
Okay. So, so then what's the current status of the whole regulatory process?
That's a question that I would very much like to know the answer to.
Yeah.
In 2010, the FDA published the results of their review. I've told you they concluded our product was safe and effective. We didn't hear anything for a very long time, nearly 2 years, no information whatsoever. In late 2012, a journalist named John Entine published a story in Slate and identified some issues that we frankly weren't aware of, that our regulatory progress had been stopped for apparently political reasons, and that there had been sort of a moratorium on moving the application forward. Since that time, the FDA has published our environmental assessment.
I think it wasn't it like 2 or 3 days after that was published? By coincidence, it comes out. I mean,
apparently,
or that isn't necessarily evidence that that John Entine had anything to do with that with his article, but it is interesting. Like he says, "Hey, the thing's halted," and then like 2 or 3 days later, no, it's not.
Yeah, many people have noted that coincidence. The comment period was initially supposed to close after 60 days. 10 days into this, the FDA decided to extend the comment period based on some letters that they received primarily from the senators from Alaska and some of the West Coast states. So the comment period on an environmental assessment closes this Friday, April 26th.
April 26th.
Interestingly enough, there's no legal requirement to post that environmental assessment for public comment. This is an exercise in transparency, and we've been, to some extent, perhaps to a great extent, a victim of transparency and political correctness, because as it turns out, we've been totally transparent, and even the agency regulating us has not been able or not willing to tell us the status of our application. So the level of apparent hypocrisy here is quite high and is of some concern.
Yeah, I imagine it's probably pretty hard because this is like the first animal transgenic trait that is this far along, and just the societal ramifications, the political ramifications, economic, and all that. Besides just what the trait is, the discussion hasn't been happening. Like, I mean, I've looked at some of the data for social science on people's perspectives to plant biotech versus animal biotech, and the plant biotech stuff is much further along in terms of the discussion and awareness and obviously the experience with it, because the crops have been growing for like 16 years or so.
And as you know, when this technology started, when recombinant technology began, it began in animal systems, bacterial and animal systems, and the plant systems lacked at the time the appropriate mechanisms and methods to mobilize and move in a defined way genetic elements. But you're correct, we have been eclipsed, primarily because there's some perception that somehow an animal is different. The other component to that is the sort of the environmental or the economic and political considerations is a slippery slope and a dangerous argument from a regulatory standpoint, because that is to some extent, the policy that the EU follows, the so-called fourth hurdle. And the thing that I find frightening there is that social, economic, and political paradigms change rather quickly, sometimes with a single election. And it's dangerous to establish regulatory policy on something that is as subjective as that. And we could very well find ourselves in a situation 5 years down the road where people say, well, why didn't we establish this technology? Why don't we have access to this? And we didn't for all the wrong reasons. So I think science-based regulatory system is an important and integral part of American enterprise and needs to be protected. And that, I think, is what's at risk here.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of discussions about that. As you said, like the economic and social and political components of regulation. Myself, I'm not sure exactly to what extent we should consider those, because, like, as you said, like the political cycle changes. What if we have it so that it's decided more or less on what party is in government? If let's say Democrats really want to have the fish and Republicans don't, then all of a sudden it's going to be like, okay, well, we're just going to wait until Democrats are in, and that's when it gets approved. And then it's like, well, but then when something comes along that's a bad idea, then it's just going to be waiting for the right politician, whatever party it is.
Who gets to decide?
Yeah, but then for the economic part, the idea is you don't want to introduce something that would harm your own economy or harm, if there's a viable business going on somewhere else, that's not going to drive them out and leave them on the streets. But at the same time, someone else might develop that in another country.
Right.
And they may do the same already. But then a new technology is itself a new opportunity. It may end up making the jobs here in the inland of the United States for raising salmon. And it's really hard to predict what the really long-term economic and societal and political consequences are going to be. The scientific stuff is a little bit easier in that sense. We got some methods for figuring that out. But yeah, I don't know if you've ever seen this old show called Connections with James Burke. That show is all about that, about the way the technologies and scientific discoveries spur one another in this totally unpredictable fashion, where you start with something that would be having to do with the spice trade, and you end up with, radar, or something like that. And it's just like, well, how are those things connected? It's just by little tiny things. And
Exactly.
the desire to control those kinds of outcomes could end up backfiring, just because we don't know really what all of them are going to be. Okay, so I think we're just about done here, and this is like half an hour of time or something like that. So I'm very happy that that we've been able to meet here and do this. Hopefully this will increase some discussion, get people thinking about this stuff. So lastly, what's your favorite recipe for salmon? What's your favorite way to eat salmon? I mean, you work in salmon and another fish.
I must tell you, we've had barbecued, poached, baked, and smoked, and a sushi, and it's all wonderful. My favorite, though, is a recipe prepared by a local chef in Canada that was a maple glazed baked salmon, and it was absolutely wonderful, and perhaps the best salmon I've ever tasted in my life. So I will share the recipe with you.
Oh, sure.
Because I know you enjoy food, but the really nice thing about this is it offers that fresh seafood, and it's a high quality product. And I am someone who enjoys seafood, and I enjoy this fish.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ron.
Karl, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I enjoyed talking with you.
And see everybody on the blog.